Chapter 1. I'm sorry, but we don't have any more room tonight. Yes, but... Jess started. Lady, if I had room, I'd let you in. I'm not being a dick. I'm just telling you we're maxed out. Try the shelter down on... The man glanced down at Jasper and hesitated. Then he went ahead and finished. 48th Street. They might have some room. Jess could tell from the man's frustrated tone she wasn't the first person to beg to be allowed in tonight. She also knew there was no way in hell she was taking Jasper to the 48th Street shelter again. There were degrees of homeless shelters in Philly, and she learned firsthand that 48th Street was one of the worst. While it was open to women only, that didn't mean it was particularly safe. Last night, they listened to a mentally ill woman cry loudly for hours, while another woman, strung out on God only knew what, screamed obscenities at anyone who looked at her twice. Jess knew, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that she and Jasper would be safer taking their chances on the streets. Instead of continuing to fight, she merely nodded, a feeling of utter defeat washing through her as she watched the man close the door to the shelter. She remained outside the door for a few moments, her mind whirling over what the hell she was supposed to do now. January is no time to learn how to be homeless, she thought wearily. Mommy, I'm cold. Jess glanced down at her sweet little 6-year-old and fought back the panic threatening to break through the cracks in her fake composure. I know, buddy. Let's what? She was the mom. She was supposed to have the answers, but she was fresh out of options. She was tired, hungry, stressed out, freaked out, and running on fumes. She'd been racing toward this brick wall in a speeding car with no brakes for weeks now. Tonight, she'd finally slammed into it. Game over. Let's walk back to Miss Debbie's and get the car. Jasper, who was obviously experiencing the same exhaustion and hunger she was, did exactly what she felt like doing. He whined, loudly, and even stamped his feet just to make sure he was driving his point home. I don't want to walk anymore. I'm too tired. The tears in his eyes were her undoing, and she swallowed the lump in her throat. She couldn't stand to see him cry, especially when none of this was his fault. She took a deep breath and beat back her panic, her fear, her own tears. She couldn't let Jasper down, and she sure as hell couldn't let him see her fall apart. She also couldn't blame him for refusing to walk on. She'd taken him on a ridiculous crisscross pattern around downtown Philadelphia in search of somewhere they could stay for the night. Debbie, another waitress at the diner where Jess worked, lived 10 blocks from here, and there was no way Jess could cajole Jasper into making that trek. It simply wasn't fair to ask it of him. Come on, she said, bending down. I'll carry you. It won't take us long. He lifted his arms and she hefted him up, positioning him on her hip securely. He was growing up so fast, getting bigger every day, and she realized her days of being able to carry her baby boy around were numbered. This way we'll stay warmer too, she added, fighting hard to infuse her tone with some optimism, a difficult task given the fact she wanted to scream the world down right now. Jasper didn't respond, either with words or even a smile. Instead, he put his head on her shoulder and closed his eyes, which proved exactly how tired he was. Lately, Jasper had been proclaiming himself too big to be coddled or babied. The fact he was willing to be carried proved she'd pushed him way past his limits today. The two of them made the trip back across town, plowing headlong into the biting, brutal January wind. Weather forecasters were predicting more snow in the next day or two. Jasper turned his face away from the strong gales, burying it in the crook of her neck and shoulder. Jess wished she could do the same. Her eyes stung, her nose ran, her cheeks were numb, and she shivered violently, even though she was bundled up in a hat, gloves, boots, and a coat. Granted, her coat and boots had seen better days, and the pointer finger on her right hand was sticking out of a hole in the glove. Nothing had gone right today. No, in truth, the shit had been hitting the fan ever since New Year's Day. That was when she'd finally run out of ways to rob Peter to pay Paul, and her landlord followed through on his months-long threat to evict them. Jess and Jasper had been couch hopping since then, trying not to overstay their welcome with friends and even acquaintances, people who truly didn't have room for them to begin with. She'd used up every favor and then some in the past 4 weeks. So, last night, for the first time, they'd resorted to sleeping in the shelter. Though Jess wouldn't call what she did there sleeping. It was probably more accurate to say Jasper slept. She merely stayed in place, sitting in an uncomfortable chair, clinging to her son, praying no one did anything to hurt them while counting the hours until morning, when she could fight her way through another day. She'd managed to grab less than an hour of sleep, which had left her stumbling around in a fog all day, her brain struggling to function properly. "I don't want to stay with Miss Debbie. The bad man is there," Jasper murmured against her neck. Jess wasn't intending to ask Debbie to take them in. They'd stayed at Debbie's house the majority of the first 3 weeks after losing their apartment. But a week ago, Debbie's husband had given the couch she and Jasper had been sharing to his just-out-of-jail brother, Mario. Mario was bad fucking news, and there was no way Jess could stay at her friend's place while he was there. Not with the way he leered and made lewd sexual comments about all the vile things he wanted to do to her. In front of Jasper. When Mario's hateful, threatening words confused and frightened her son, Jess had tried to explain as gently as she could to her sweet, innocent little boy that there were good people in the world, but there were also some bad ones as well. Unfortunately, it felt like all she and Jasper had been encountering lately were the bad people, including not only Mario, but also a junkie who tried to steal her bag on the street, the guy at the grocery store who'd embarrassed them when they didn't have enough money to buy the few measly things in their basket, and Jess sighed and mentally added Brenda, her former babysitter, to the list. It was Brenda's fault they'd been too late to get in line for a bed at the shelter. Brenda was a stay-at-home mom of 3 rambunctious boys, and she'd agreed to take care of Jasper after school every day until Jess finished her shift at the diner. That afternoon, Brenda had claimed her husband, Rodney, didn't want her to babysit Jasper anymore. Apparently, he didn't like having a house full of loud kids when he got home from work. Then she informed Jess that Jasper had broken a lamp. Jasper said it was an accident and he was sorry, but Brenda was too pissed off to accept his apology. Jess tried to explain that removing Jasper from the equation wasn't going to make Brenda's house suddenly quiet, but the woman wouldn't back down, claiming she was done taking care of someone else's brat. Then she demanded that Jess pay everything she owed her for babysitting, plus $50 for a lamp Jess was certain hadn't cost more than $20. It had taken every bit of the tip money she had in her purse to cover the debt, which meant in addition to having no place to stay tonight, she didn't even have cash to buy them food. And now, she only had 2 days to figure out childcare for Jasper after school on Monday. She pushed that worry away until tomorrow. The more pressing problem was getting them through tonight. Jess blew out a sigh of relief when they arrived at Debbie's. She considered going in for a moment and asking to stay, but then she recalled Mario's comments about her tight ass and how he'd like to fuck it raw. So, instead, she reached into her bag and pulled out her car keys. Her car was the one thing she'd refused to relinquish when facing eviction, even if the money she could have made off selling the hunk of junk would have paid a couple of bills initially. She'd decided against it. For one thing, it really was a piece of shit, and she'd be lucky to get a few $100 for it. Nowhere near enough to allow them to rent a new apartment or keep the old one for more than a month or 2. Plus, she needed the car to get to her weekend job as a housekeeper at a motel on the outskirts of Philadelphia. If she was being honest with herself, she knew she was going to have to sell the car at some point. But as she considered the dire straits she and Jasper were in at the moment, she was glad to have the security blanket of a vehicle. If she could just hold on to it until spring and better weather. For now, she was able to park it for free at Debbie's. The only time she drove it was on the weekends, so it wasn't like she was wasting a ton of money on gas. The rest of the week, she and Jasper either took the bus, the subway, or walked everywhere. "Come on, Jasper, hop in." She opened the back door and secured Jasper into his booster seat. Then she reached for a blanket she kept in the car and tucked it around him. Once he was settled, she bopped him on the nose with the finger sticking out of her glove. His scowl finally loosened, and he giggled. "You're silly, Mommy." She walked around to the driver's side and climbed behind the wheel, briefly sending up the same short prayer she always did when she turned the key. "Please start." Mercifully, and for the first time today, something went right, and the engine turned over. She cranked the heat up on high, even though she knew it would be at least 10 minutes before it stopped blowing out cold air. Right now, she was so fucking freezing, even the cool air felt like a blessing. She pulled out of the parking lot with absolutely no clue where she was going. All she knew was they were out of the frigid night air and off the streets. "Are we going to get some dinner? I'm hungry." Damn. Now that he was sitting down and out of the cold, it seemed Jasper had moved on to the next item on his list of needs. Jess did a mental inventory of what she had in her gargantuan bag. Ever since losing their home, she was never without her oversized canvas tote, where she kept her wallet, a change of clothes for both her and Jasper, toiletries, and snacks. "Let's find somewhere to park and I'll rustle up something for us." Jess glanced at her gas gauge and grimaced when she realized she only had a quarter of a tank. She'd resigned herself to the idea that they would have to sleep in the car, even though the thought terrified her. The streets of Philadelphia weren't somewhere she really wanted to be after dark, and there was no way she had enough gas to keep the car running all night. She considered her empty wallet again. No help there, she thought. Wait, it wasn't completely empty. She fumbled around inside the bag for her wallet while she waited at a stoplight. Once she found it, she withdrew the business card tucked inside and looked at the address. The place wasn't too far from here. She turned left at the next stoplight, her course decided. When she pulled up in front of the building, she parallel parked on the street in the spot right outside the main entrance and put the car in park. She took a moment to study the large 4-story brick building that was a perfect blend of old and new architecture. Connected to the other buildings on either side, it took up a large part of the block, boasting a corner spot. She'd always been fond of American history, so when she'd first arrived in Philadelphia, she'd enjoyed walking around the city, studying houses and historical sites that had been around since the 19th century. It was clear this building was quite old, though it had been beautifully restored. The tall, arched windows on the first floor were part of the original design, but the glass inside was new, crystal clear and shiny. The sign on the main entry indicated the two businesses, a doctor's office and a restoration company that resided behind the dark brown wooden door. The front portico was impressive, grand and inviting, made even more so by the ornate lunette window above the door. She assumed the businesses occupied the first and second floors, which were both dark, as it was well after work hours. However, there was lots of lights coming from the top 2 floors, allowing her to easily see the 3rd-story balcony that jutted out above a large bay window on the 2nd floor. She found herself wondering about those top 2 floors. Not because she was terribly fascinated in the layout of the building, but because she was curious about the people inside. She'd lifted the business card several months earlier from a bulletin board her boss had hanging near the front door of the diner, his way of promoting local businesses. At the time, she hadn't been able to reason out why on earth she thought she'd ever need it. She sure as hell didn't have a home that needed renovation. Jess had brushed it off initially as a foolish and lonely woman's silliness. The men who lived here, Tony Moretti, who owned the restoration company, as well as the doctor Rhys Beaumont, were regulars at the diner where she worked, so she'd seen them pretty much weekly ever since she'd started working there 4 years ago. She'd overheard them talking about buying this building a couple of years earlier, describing their plans for renovating it to their weekly Wednesday lunch companions, a large group of men who were either relatives or friends. She'd been so enthralled by their intentions for the building, she'd eavesdropped more than was polite, refilling their water glasses far too often. The men always sat in her section at the diner, and the other waitresses constantly expressed their jealousy over the fact. Tony, Rhys, and the other men were all handsome and funny, kind to her, and good tippers. Those small tidbits, plus their names, occupations, and this address, thanks to the business card, were the sum total of Jess's knowledge about them. So coming here had been stupid as hell, because apart from where she worked and her first name, the men didn't know her either. And there was no way she could knock on that grand, gorgeous door and say, "Hey, remember me from the diner? Can my son and I crash on your couch tonight?" She shook her head, feeling like a fool for thinking the words and even more foolish for coming here. Chalk up another stupid decision due to her lack of sleep. Her mother had always accused her of having too much pride. But damn if it hadn't taken a beating this month. Regardless, she pushed away thoughts of the strangers inside the building, turning her attention to the more pressing matter. Unfastening her seatbelt, she twisted around so she could speak to Jasper. "Are you up for a little adventure tonight?" she asked, trying to infuse as much excitement into her tone as possible. Jasper gave her a curious look. "What?" "We're camping," she said, aware the word alone would help sell her insane idea to her son. As expected, he lit up like a Christmas tree, his eyes going wide. The two of them had spent a lot of time at the public library this month, as it gave them somewhere warm to kill a few hours so they wouldn't arrive at her friends' houses until just before bedtime. She'd been working hard not to overstay her welcome or be an unwanted burden. Jasper's latest obsession was camping books. She couldn't count how many times she'd read Llama Llama Loves Camping and Curious George Goes Camping to him in the past few weeks. "We are?" he said, unhooking his seatbelt to jump up and hug her. She laughed at his enthusiasm, even though she knew what she was proposing was stupid and even dangerous. "Yes, but our camping is going to be a little different from the books we've been reading because we're going city camping." Jasper was squirming around, full of energy now. "What's that?" "Well, since it's winter, we have to improvise. So we're going to build a backseat tent out of clothes. All our clothes." God bless 6-year-olds and their willingness to try anything. "Okay," he shouted, unable to contain himself. "But first, camp food." She did an internal eye roll because, while she'd never camped, something told her peanut butter crackers weren't the normal fare when crowding around a campfire. Pulling half a sleeve of saltines and a nearly empty jar of peanut butter from her bag, she waved them in the air as if displaying something really wonderful. "Since we don't have a camp stove or fire, we'll have to eat something that doesn't need to be cooked." Then she dug around in her bag again, withdrawing a plastic knife. When she'd been younger, she'd read the Harry Potter books voraciously. The tote she now carried reminded her of Hermione's charmed bag in the final book, the one with a magic extender that allowed her to carry tents, books, pots and pans, and countless other things. Jess's bag was the Muggle equivalent, her version heavy as hell, containing very little that would actually help them. Jess spread the peanut butter on the crackers, more thinly than she'd have liked, but she wanted to stretch it out. In the end, she was able to make 5 peanut butter cracker sandwiches, and despite her growling stomach, she gave them all to Jasper because he was a growing boy, and she refused to take a single bite of food if she could keep him from going to sleep hungry tonight. "You don't want one?" Jasper asked. She shook her head. "Nope, I had a big lunch. I'm still too full. Couldn't eat another bite." It was just a little white lie, and enough to convince her son, who shoved the crackers in his mouth like he'd never eaten before. She'd noticed lately that Jasper attacked his food like it might be his last meal, shoveling it in far too quickly. She'd told him countless times to slow down, but the words fell on deaf ears. The same vice-like pressure that had been slowly crushing her since she'd come home from work to find the eviction notice taped to their door pressed down hard, and she found it difficult to take in a deep breath of air. Something was going to have to give, but she didn't have a clue what. She was terrified of going to social services. Her mother hadn't been the world's greatest. Before she finally managed to get sober for good, her mom had been a mean drunk who sometimes forgot to come home at night. As a result, Jess had been shuffled in and out of the foster care system a handful of times when she wasn't much older than Jasper, and the experience had stuck with her in a negative way. There was no way in hell she would ever let Jasper experience the bone-shaking fear of sleeping in a house full of strangers, some of whom hadn't been kind at all. What if social services deemed her an unfit mom? What if they took Jasper away from her? The thought of spending a single night away from him made her physically ill. But would that be better for him? Was she being selfish, keeping him with her because of her own feelings. He was cold and hungry and tired, and that was her fault. She'd failed him, failed them both. But she didn't know what more she could do. She worked 7 days a week for minimum wage and tips, and she hadn't taken a single day off for herself, though she'd missed one day last spring when Jasper fell down at school and broke his arm. That was the day that had begun their downhill descent, as she'd started drowning in doctor and hospital bills, in addition to rent and food and Jasper's ever-growing feet, which seemed to need new shoes every time she turned around. God, she hated feeling so helpless. Time to get a grip. Jess tried to shake off the heavy feelings. Again. This was just a bad night at the end of a bad day. They were going to get through tonight, and then tomorrow, she'd come up with a real plan. There had to be a place for women and children in the same position she and Jasper were in. It was time she stopped letting her fear of social services overwhelm her better judgment. She couldn't keep waiting for a miracle that was never coming. She was an adult, and it was time to act like one, time to figure this shit out. Tomorrow, she would put the time at the library to good use, researching options for homeless women and children in the city, and she would bite the bullet and seek help from social services. She stifled a yawn and blinked a few times, her eyes dry from lack of sleep. Jess turned off the car and got out to open the trunk. They were on a well-lit, quiet street, away from the heavier traffic of downtown. Her landlord had only given them 30 minutes to vacate their apartment, so she'd been forced to quickly shove everything she could into trash bags and lug them down to her car. The trunk had become their closet since then. She grabbed 3 huge overstuffed bags, carrying them to the back car door. Opening it, she put them onto the seat next to Jasper, then returned to the trunk to pull out a blanket and a comforter from the twin beds they had in their one-bedroom apartment. Returning to the car, she quickly climbed back into the driver's seat, kneeling on it and facing backwards so she could cocoon Jasper in a mountain of clothing that she prayed would keep him warm enough. In addition to that, she figured she had enough gas to run the heater 10 minutes every hour until dawn, and still have enough to get to the motel for work in the morning. Hopefully, all of that would get them through the freezing cold night. She pushed Jasper's booster seat onto the floor, then told him to add 3 more pairs of socks to his feet, something he found absolutely hilarious. She let his childlike laughter bolster her, help her to beat back the terror she felt, so that she could make him believe this truly was a great adventure, instead of the actions of a desperate woman. She threw another sweatshirt on over his head, then put his coat, hat, and gloves back on. Okay, here. She twisted around the back of the driver's seat awkwardly, grabbing a pile of shirts. Lay down on the seat and you can use these as your pillow. Jasper followed her instructions, though she wasn't sure if it was exhaustion or excitement making him so compliant. Once he'd settled down comfortably, she picked up the comforter and tucked him in tightly. Thanks to the heater, the car was actually quite toasty. For now. But she knew it would be a different story when she was forced to turn the vehicle off to conserve gas. He looked at her expectantly. After all, she had promised a tent. And now, for the rest. With a flourish, she picked up one of the bags of clothing and dumped it on Jasper, prompting loud peals of laughter from her young son. "Mommy," he said between giggles, "this isn't a tent." She upended another bag of clothes on him, praying it would be enough to keep him warm throughout the night. "What?" she asked, pretending to be confused. "This isn't a tent? Are you sure?" His wide grin gave her a great view of the gap left behind from his loss of a front baby tooth. She could tell, even by the dimness of the street lamps, that the other one was loose as hell and wouldn't be far behind. "I'm sure," he insisted. "Then I guess we're going to have to change the name of our structure," she said as she picked up the last bag and shook the clothing out on top of him. "This isn't a tent. It's a cocoon." She knew he'd understand the word because they'd learned about caterpillars turning into butterflies in his class at school. He'd come home that day to share what had been a thrilling discovery with her. Jasper was an intelligent, inquisitive boy who had a genuine love for learning. She hoped that never changed. Once he was buried in a pile of clothing, she glanced at his still happy face. "All good?" she asked, not allowing herself to ask what she really wanted to know, which was whether or not he was warm enough. She was afraid to point out her true purpose in case he figured out this wasn't really a game. He nodded. Good. So let me get settled and I'll read you one of your library books. Bedtime stories were their one constant. She'd read to him even when he was a baby and too young to understand. And the ritual had become even more important, not just to him but to her as well, as they found themselves sleeping in different strange places at night. Jess quickly removed her own boots, adding 2 more pairs of socks. She added another t-shirt and a sweatshirt to her layer of clothing, then put her boots, gloves, hat, and coat back on. Tucking the last remaining blanket over her, she picked up a book and turned off the car. Okay. She took a deep breath, holding the book up over her head, finding the perfect beam from a streetlight so that she could see the words. Jasper would probably struggle to see the pictures, but they'd read this story many times. That wouldn't matter. There is a house, a napping house, she began. As she read, she realized she didn't need to see the words any more than Jasper needed a view of the pictures. This book was one of their favorites, and as she began the sing-song repetition, she looked less and less at the words and more at the illustrations. At the cozy bedroom, the warm bed, the safe home. Jasper was asleep before she finished the story, but she kept reading it. When she reached the end, she closed the book, tucked the blanket around herself, where it would do little to keep her warm, and shivered as she sent a wish out to the universe, not just for herself, but for her son as well. Help us find a home, she whispered to the night air.
You can listen to the rest of the book in the Tempt Romance audiobooks app, available on the App Store and Google Play. The link to the book is in the description. Discover even more bestsellers and exclusive stories updated weekly, only in Tempt Romance audiobooks.